pivot, try to get into new markets. And long term, what we're doing is we're building.
A reporter stood up at a press conference today and asked Canada's industry minister a very simple question. How long is your government expecting these tariffs to last? Her answer? Your question, Mike. You don't know. I don't know. So this is not up to us to answer that question because these decisions will be taken south of our border. That was Melanie Joly, Canada's Minister of Industry, announcing a $1.5 billion relief package for Canadian steel, aluminum, and copper workers. She doesn't know how long the problem lasts. She doesn't know if the money will work. But she did know one thing. She was going to announce the $1.5 billion, duck the accountability questions, and get out of that room. And that is just the beginning of what we are unpacking today. Let me lay the facts out cleanly, because a lot of commentary on this gets loud without getting specific. On May 5th, 2026, the Canadian federal government announced a $1.5 billion package targeting industries hit hardest by Trump's tariff regime: steel, aluminum, and copper. Here is what that package actually consists of. $1 billion of it flows through the Business Development Bank of Canada, the BDC. These are loans on what the government calls favorable terms. 0 interest in year 1, very low rates in years 2 and 3, and 0 repayment required for the entire 3-year window. That sounds generous. The remaining $500 million is directed at what Ottawa is calling strategic pivot money, funds for companies that want to restructure their business away from U.S. market dependency. Now, on the surface, you may say, okay, tariffs are real, these industries are getting hammered, the government is stepping in. Fine, but here is the question a reporter tried to ask, the question that got the eye roll heard around Canada. On this actual program, what kind of oversight is going to be in place to make sure that the money actually goes to keep the workers working, rather than going to CEO bonuses like we've seen with some of the COVID pandemic loans? Watch what happened next. That reporter was referring to something very real. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Canadian Emergency Business Loans, the CEBA program, saw billions distributed with limited verification mechanisms. A parliamentary budget officer report later flagged significant gaps in accountability for how that money was tracked once it left government hands. The reporter wasn't being rude. He was asking the single most important question about a $1.5 billion announcement, and he got an eye roll. If you are an American watching this, think about it this way. Imagine a U.S. senator announcing a $15 billion relief package for the steel belt, and when asked about oversight, just rolling their eyes at the question. That clip would dominate the news cycle for a week. In Canada, it barely made the scroll. But here is where the story gets significantly more complicated, and frankly, more alarming. At the same time Joly was announcing the tariff relief, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne was out promoting something the government is calling Canada's first ever sovereign wealth fund. They're calling it the Canada Strong Fund. Here is how Champagne pitched it. You may want, it's not if you and I would want to invest in a pipeline or invest in a project of national interest. It's pretty difficult as retail investors to join in. Now, you'll have the possibility. He went on to call it something no other country in the world has done, allowing citizens to directly invest in nation-building projects alongside the government. Sounds exciting, right? Here is the problem. A sovereign wealth fund, the real kind, is what Norway built. Norway took oil and gas royalty revenues, surplus cash the government had after paying its bills, and put it into a massive investment vehicle. That fund is now worth almost $2 trillion US. Norway draws down the returns every year to fund its budget. The principal just keeps growing. The Canada Strong Fund is the opposite of that. Canada is running a deficit measured in the tens of billions of dollars. Canada's net debt is approximately 1.4 trillion Canadian dollars. Canada does not have surplus wealth to invest. As the Globe and Mail editorial board put it directly, it's not a sovereign wealth fund. It's more like a leveraged private equity fund, only with bureaucrats. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation was even blunter, telling Reason magazine, Carney's fund is not built on wealth or savings. It's built on borrowed money, and it's going to gamble tax dollars on risky corporate handouts. And the parliamentary budget officer, Canada's independent fiscal watchdog, noted that the announcement lacks critical details. No governance structure, no investment policy, no risk management framework, no accountability mechanisms. Nothing. Pierre Poilievre, the conservative opposition leader, said it plainly. If a project has a business case, why would the government need to fund it? If it doesn't have a business case, why would the government want to fund it? Here is the economic reality that this fund is responding to, even if it won't admit it. According to Royal Bank of Canada, there is $1 trillion of investment capital that originated in Canada, but is now deployed outside Canada. Statistics. Canada reported that Canadian pension funds alone held $1.33 trillion in foreign assets as of Q3 last year. A majority of Canada's own pension money is invested outside its borders. That is not a cash problem. That is a conditions problem. Private capital is not leaving Canada because it doesn't exist. It's leaving because it can't generate a competitive return inside Canada due to regulatory bottlenecks, high energy costs, and policy uncertainty. So the government's solution is not to fix the conditions. It is to borrow $25 billion, brand it patriotically, and invite ordinary Canadians to put their savings into it alongside the government. Socializing the risk, keeping the control. Now I want to talk about something that most coverage has completely ignored because it is buried in a single word inside a speech that most people didn't watch. Mark Carney was in Armenia at the European Political Community Summit, representing Canada as the first non-European country ever invited to that forum. He was on stage bragging about Canada's critical mineral strategy. He said Canada had signed $18 billion worth of critical minerals deals across 20 of the world's leading minerals. Big number. Sounds impressive. But here is the word that should have stopped everyone in their tracks. He said Canada is warehousing these minerals, holding them specifically for government-to-government deals with G7 partners and European allies. Warehousing, not selling to the highest bidder, not letting Canadian mining companies optimize their returns. Warehousing for diplomatic use. Now compare that to this. Just days before this speech, Carney and multiple Liberal commentators were on Canadian television explicitly arguing that deals Donald Trump signs with other countries aren't worth the paper they're written on. Too unstable, can't be trusted, meaningless photo ops. And yet, Carney flew to Europe to brag about $18 billion worth of memorandums of understanding, non-binding agreements, handshakes and photo ops that haven't broken ground on a single project. The exact thing they criticized Trump for, they are doing, and proudly. But the warehousing admission is the deeper issue. Europe accounts for approximately 4 to 6% of Canada's total trade. The United States accounts for roughly 75%, with deeply integrated supply chains on both sides of the border. So Canada is choosing to warehouse its most critical natural resources, the minerals that the entire global economy is fighting over. Not for the neighbor that buys 3/4 of everything Canada sells, but for a continent that buys less than 6 cents of every dollar in Canadian exports. Why? Because those are the diplomatic relationships the Carney government values. Because Europe validates the globalist, multilateral, rules-based order worldview that Carney has been building his career around for 2 decades. Not because it's good for Canadian workers, not because it drives Canadian prosperity, because it earns standing in the rooms where the global elite make decisions. And Canadian taxpayers and American consumers who depend on North American supply chains are funding that ambition. Now let's talk about what Carney actually said on that stage in Armenia, because this is the line that went globally viral, and for good reason. It's my strong personal view that as the international order will be rebuilt, it will be rebuilt out of Europe. Canada's sitting prime minister on a world stage, saying the future of the international order will be built not in North America, not out of Canada, but out of Europe. Now, there are 2 ways to hear this. The charitable interpretation, Carney is a realist. He looks at Trump's America, withdrawing from multilateral institutions, using tariffs as weapons, making unpredictable moves, and he sees Europe as the anchor of the rules-based international order he believes in. He's positioning Canada there. The less charitable interpretation, a Canadian leader whose entire country's economic survival depends on its relationship with the United States, flew to another continent and told them the future belongs to them, not to his own country, not to North America. while his own industries are bleeding from American tariffs that he has no credible plan to resolve. In the same speech, Carney also told the European political community that Canada is the most European of non-European countries. Think about that framing for a moment. Not the most Canadian of countries, not a proudly sovereign North American nation with its own distinct identity. The most European, non-European country. You would never hear an American president on a foreign stage say the United States is just like somewhere else. In most countries of the world, that would be received as an admission of failure. A leader who doesn't believe in his own nation enough to champion it on its own terms. In Ottawa, it's treated as sophistication. Meanwhile, while Carney is telling Europeans that their continent is the future, Canada's steelworkers are waiting for loans with no clear oversight mechanisms. Canada's critical minerals are being warehoused for diplomatic favors. Canada's pension funds are investing a majority of their capital outside the country because they can't get returns inside it. The Prime Minister of Canada is in Europe, and his finance minister is back home launching a wealth fund Canada cannot afford and inviting citizens to throw their savings into it. If you're watching this from the United States, you may be wondering why any of this matters to you. Let me connect those dots clearly. Steel and aluminum. Canada is one of America's largest suppliers of both. The tariff escalation, Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian metals, Canada's retaliatory tariffs, has disrupted deeply integrated supply chains that took decades to build. American manufacturers in auto, construction, and defense depend on Canadian inputs. A destabilized, debt-laden Canadian government making erratic policy decisions creates real supply chain risk for American industry. CUSMA NAFTA renegotiation. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement is up for review. Carney's government is signaling it wants to reduce economic dependence on the United States. That is an openly stated policy goal. For American negotiators, understanding who Canada is orienting toward and the financial constraints of their government matters enormously at the negotiating table. Critical minerals. The United States and Canada are in an active contest with China over critical minerals supply chains, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths. These are the building blocks of electric vehicles, semiconductors, and defense technology. Canada has enormous reserves. If Ottawa is warehousing those minerals for European diplomatic deals rather than building North American supply chain partnerships, American manufacturers and the Pentagon are going to feel that. The debt trajectory. Canada is a AAA-rated sovereign borrower. When that rating changes, when the cost of Canadian government debt rises, it ripples through North American capital markets. A government borrowing to fund a wealth fund it cannot afford while running deficits it has no clear plan to close is a fiscal risk story that does not stay contained north of the 49th parallel. This is not a foreign policy story. This is a North American economic stability story. And right now, the person steering that ship is telling the world the future is going to be built in Europe. Let me bring this back to where we started. $1.5 billion was announced today for steel, aluminum, and copper industries hit by tariffs. The reporter asked the right question. How do we know this money goes to workers and not to executive bonuses and shareholder payouts, the way some COVID loans did? And the minister rolled her eyes. Here is what a government that had actually learned from COVID would do. They would announce the money and in the same breath outline the performance conditions, the clawback provisions, the public reporting requirements, the oversight mechanisms. They would say, here's how you qualify. Here's what you have to demonstrate in terms of maintained employment. Here's how we audit the spending. Here's what happens if you misuse the funds. Instead, we got, we're in a trade war. Everyone's on the same side. The money is going out. That is not accountability. That is a press release. And there is a pattern here that Canadians and anyone watching Canada from the outside should recognize. Announce big numbers. Use patriotic language. Avoid the specific, uncomfortable follow-up questions. Frame any scrutiny as partisanship or being on the side of Trump. Move on before the details can be checked. The Canada Strong Fund announcement had no governance structure, no investment framework, no accountability mechanisms, as the parliamentary budget officer noted in black and white. Just a number, a name, a locomotive backdrop, and a comparison to the Canadian Pacific Railway. The $1.5 billion tariff relief package has favorable loan terms, but zero specifics on oversight of where that money actually lands. This is a government operating on the assumption that the optics of action are a substitute for the substance of accountability. And the reporter who got eye-rolled, he was the only one in the room doing his job. Here is the bottom line. Canada is in a genuine economic emergency. The tariff war with the United States is real. The disruption to steel, aluminum, copper, auto, it is real. Workers are losing hours. Companies are bleeding. The response from the Carney government has been announce large dollar figures, use the language of sovereignty and nation building, pivot aggressively toward Europe, and launch a wealth fund that is actually a debt vehicle dressed in patriotic branding. What the response has not been, fix the regulatory environment that drove $1 trillion of investment out of Canada, reduce the energy costs that make Canadian industry uncompetitive, create the port, rail, and export infrastructure needed to actually access the new markets they keep promising. Give private capital a reason to come home. A government that is confident in its economic plan doesn't need to borrow $25 billion to fund a wealth fund. It doesn't need to ask citizens to put their savings into uneconomic nation-building projects. It creates conditions where money flows there naturally. The investment exists. It comes from Canada. It just cannot get a return in Canada. Until that changes, the billion-dollar announcements are not solutions. They are increasingly expensive Band-Aids on a wound the government refuses to actually treat. I'll be watching, and so should you. If this gave you something to think about, like subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop your take in the comments. Do you think the oversight question deserved a straight answer? Let's talk about it.